The wind tore across the endless white plain, a merciless whisper that sliced through the silence like a knife. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the bruised sky, settling on the fur of Elara's coat as she trudged up the ridge. It had been another long, cold day of setting traps and checking snares, just enough to keep her alive for another week. She was used to the stillness by now, used to the way her own voice seemed strange when she spoke aloud to no one. The mountains had been her only company for 3 years, ever since the fever took her family and the world stopped feeling like a place she belonged in. But that night, the stillness broke. At first, she thought it was the groan of trees bending in the wind. Then came the howl, low and haunting, rising over the frozen pines. Wolves. Close. Elara stopped, her breath fogging the air. Wolves didn't scare her. Not anymore, but the tone of that howl was wrong. It wasn't a call of hunger. It was the sound of a hunt already underway. Then she heard something else. A sharp crack. A gunshot. Her heart jolted. Out here, that could only mean one thing. Someone was in trouble. She slung her rifle from her shoulder and started running, boots crunching through the snow. The cold bit into her cheeks, and the world narrowed to the sound of her breath and the pounding of her heart. The trees parted into a clearing, and the sight that met her eyes froze her in place. A man lay sprawled in the snow, his coat torn open and soaked in blood. A horse, his horse, was collapsed beside him, its throat ripped open. Encircling them, their eyes glowing like embers in the dying light, were 3 wolves. Their breath steamed in the air, and their low growls rumbled through the stillness. For a heartbeat, Elara stood there, hidden behind a pine, her mind racing. If she fired and missed, they'd turn on her. If she did nothing, the man would die. He was already half dead, his body twitching weakly in the snow. Damn it, she whispered to herself, raising her rifle. The first shot rang out, echoing across the valley. One wolf dropped instantly, a dark shape collapsing into the snow. The others whipped their heads toward her, snarling. She reloaded as fast as her shaking hands would allow, the click of metal the only sound in the frozen air. The second shot tore through another wolf's shoulder. It yelped and limped backward, baring its teeth but too wounded to charge. The third wolf hesitated, eyes flicking between its fallen kin and the figure standing firm with the rifle. Then, with a low snarl, it turned and vanished into the treeline. Elara waited, her breath ragged, the rifle still aimed. The silence returned, heavy and final. Only the wind moved now. She ran to the man. His face was pale, lips cracked and blue, eyes fluttering as if fighting to stay conscious. Blood stained the snow beneath him, seeping from a jagged wound in his shoulder. "Hey," she said, kneeling beside him, her voice urgent but gentle. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, gray, sharp even through the haze of pain. You an angel," he muttered, his voice rough and fading. She let out a shaky breath that almost became a laugh. "Hardly. You're not dying on me, cowboy. Not tonight." With trembling hands, she tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it against the wound. He groaned, flinching, but she kept the pressure steady. The cold was her enemy now. The longer he stayed out here, the faster his body would surrender. She glanced at his horse, then at the endless snow stretching back toward her cabin. It was a long way. But she'd done harder things. "All right," she murmured, sliding her arms under his shoulders. "We're getting you out of here." He was heavy, his limbs limp, his coat soaked through. She gritted her teeth and dragged him, inch by inch, through the snow. The cold bit into her skin, numbing her hands and burning her lungs. Every few steps, she stopped to catch her breath, glancing back to make sure the wolves hadn't returned. But the forest stayed silent. By the time she saw the faint outline of her cabin through the drifting snow, her muscles were screaming, her arms trembling. She half pulled, half carried him inside, kicking the door shut behind her. The warmth of the fire hit her like a wave. She laid him on the bed, stripped off his soaked coat, and cleaned the wound as best she could. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering things she didn't understand, names, places, fragments of pain. She boiled water, stitched the wound with careful hands, and prayed under her breath that he'd survive until morning. Hours passed. The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm howled, but inside there was only the sound of his breathing, uneven but steady. She sat beside him, exhaustion washing over her. When he stirred, just before dawn, his eyes met hers again. "Name's Cole," he whispered hoarsely. "Cole Harper." "Elara," she replied softly. "You're safe now." He smiled faintly, eyes already closing again. "Didn't think angels lived in the mountains." She chuckled under her breath, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "They don't," she murmured. "Just stubborn women." As the first light of morning slipped through the frosted window, Elara sat back in her chair, watching the color return slowly to his face. She didn't know who he was, or what he'd done to end up bleeding in the snow, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of melting snow, firelight, and quiet recovery. Cole drifted in and out of sleep while Elara cared for him, her movements steady and practiced, though her mind was anything but calm. She had patched up strangers before, hunters, trappers, even a soldier once, but never had anyone stirred something in her quite like this man did. There was a stubbornness in his eyes, even when fever burned through him. A will to survive that matched her own. Each morning, she would light the stove, boil water, and check his wound. It healed slowly, but surely. When he was strong enough to sit up, he started asking questions: where he was, how long he'd been there, who had saved him. She answered in short sentences, her voice soft but distant. She wasn't used to talking much. Words felt heavy after years of silence. "I owe you my life," he said one morning, his voice low as he stared at the fire. She looked up from the herbs she was grinding. "You owe me nothing. You'd have done the same." Cole smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I've ridden 1,000 miles through this country, and I can tell you, not many would have risked facing wolves for a stranger." Her eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time, she smiled, barely, but enough. "Maybe I just don't like wolves." After that, things became easier between them. When he could walk again, Cole insisted on helping around the cabin. He chopped wood despite the ache in his shoulder, mended the fence outside, and even fixed the door hinge that had been loose for months. Elara protested at first, but she couldn't deny the relief of not doing everything alone. It had been years since anyone else's footsteps echoed on her floorboards. At night, when the storms rolled in, they'd sit by the fire together. Cole would tell stories of the towns he'd seen, the dusty saloons, the desert sunsets, the lawmen and outlaws chasing each other across endless miles of land. Elara listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of tea. Sometimes, she caught herself watching his face instead of listening to his words. There was a ruggedness to him, a steadiness that made her feel oddly safe, though she hated to admit it. "You ever think of leaving this place?" he asked one night. She shook her head, staring into the flames. "There's nothing for me out there anymore. Everything I had, it's buried under the snow." He didn't press her, though his expression softened. "You're too young to spend your life hiding from the world." She gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Maybe, but the world stopped looking for me a long time ago." They fell silent then, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. By the time spring crept through the valley, Cole's strength had returned. The snow melted into rivers that sang through the forest, and the air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Elara watched as he saddled a horse he'd traded for with one of her furs, his movements calm but deliberate. "So this is goodbye," she said, standing by the doorway. He paused, turning toward her. "For now," he said. "You saved me, Elara. I can't just ride off and forget that." She crossed her arms, though her heart twisted. "Men always say that. They never come back." Cole met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm not most men." He mounted the horse, tipping his hat to her. "You take care of yourself, Angel." And then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the whisper of wind through the trees. For weeks after, Elara went about her days as she always had, chopping wood, hunting, tending the small garden near her cabin, but something inside her felt different. The silence she'd once cherished now felt heavier. Sometimes she'd catch herself glancing at the ridge, half expecting to see him returning through the mist. But he never came. Until he did. It was late summer when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats. She stepped outside, squinting against the sunlight, and there he was, dusty from the trail, a small smile tugging at his lips. In his hand was a small wooden box. "I told you I'd come back," he said, dismounting. Elara crossed her arms, though she couldn't hide the smile that crept onto her face. You're late. Had to find the right thing. He opened the box, revealing a simple silver ring that glinted in the light. Didn't have much money, but I figured you wouldn't care about that. Her breath caught. Cole, what are you doing? He took her hand gently, his voice steady but soft. Elara, I've seen 100 sunsets in 1,000 towns, but I've never met anyone like you. You saved me when you didn't have to. You've lived out here with nothing but ghosts and wolves, and still found it in you to show kindness. I don't want to keep riding alone. I want a reason to come home. She stared at him, torn between disbelief and the ache that had been building in her chest for months. You can't mean that, she whispered. I mean every word. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of trees and the distant call of a hawk. Finally, she smiled, soft, uncertain, but real. You're a fool, Cole Harper. Then marry me, he said, grinning. Be a fool with me. And she did. The seasons turned, and the cabin that once echoed with emptiness filled with laughter and warmth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind howled through the forest, Elara would remember that winter. The blood in the snow, the wolves, glowing eyes, the man she'd dragged from death itself. She'd reach for Cole's hand, feel the warmth of his skin, and know that the world, in all its cruelty and chaos, had given her something rare and beautiful. The lonely girl who thought she'd been forgotten by life had rescued a dying cowboy, and in doing so, she'd rescued herself.